Dr. Stephen Kerr. Dr. Kerr is an Associate Provost for Academic and International Affairs at Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, Boston. With his roots in India, where he pursued masters from ICT Mumbai, he further went to get doctorate degree in medicinal chemistry from University at Buffalo, NY, and postdoctoral in pharmacology from Yale University. With total 28 years of teaching experience, Dr. Kerr has received a number of awards, with the recent being Dean's Exceptional Service Award 2023 and number of appreciation awards from various colleges. 11 undergraduate research projects and advised more than 20 graduate student theses. He has 5 grants, 13 peer-reviewed articles, 5 book chapters, and number of referred abstracts, adding feather to his cap. He has been invited speaker of number of conferences and external reviewer of PhD dissertations and reviewer of many journals from publishers like Elsewhere, Springer, Wiley, etc. Now I request Dr. Stephen Kerr to share insights on enzyme inhibition from past to present development of proteolysin targeting chimeras. I welcome you, sir.
Can you hear me okay? Thank you for the invitation, and good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to be here today and be part of this conference. I do want to thank Dr. Sriraj Joshi for inviting me, the organizing committee for putting up such a wonderful show so far, and I hope it continues for the rest of the day today. I thought I'd share with you some of the drug development over the, I would say, almost the past century and a quarter. So what I want to share with you today with this talk is to take you back to when we really had no sort of strategic, rational development of drugs, to some of the development, the way that we're thinking about how we can go about, making new therapeutic agents. So that's what I want to share with you today. Since I see many of you are students, I'm going to take you back about 100 years when we start, just to give you that perspective as to where we were at one time and the way that the field has developed over the last century. Okay. So the timeline when we think about drug development, and I'm going back to, if you think about 1890s, right, where people was just starting to think about protein, ligand, interactions, receptors, enzymes, and there was a biochemist called Emil Fischer. You might have heard of him in biochemistry in some of your courses, where he developed this theory of enzymes having a so-called lock and key model, meaning the enzyme was a lock, right, and the ligand or the drug was the key, and when the key fits into the lock, that's what happens with the function of the enzyme. So that was Emil Fischer back in the 1898, early 1900s. Okay, and that was the theory that, okay, that's how these proteins, and 99% of proteins, enzymes are proteins. Today, of course, we also know that nucleic acids can act as enzymes, right? We have ribozymes, which are RNA molecules. And so that was the thinking about how these enzymes work. That it had this very specific ligand or the substrate, another word for a ligand, we can use the term substrate, where it would fit directly into this protein, this molecule, this enzyme or RNA or whatever you want to call it, and only if it fits perfectly, there would be some activity, right? But then in the 1950s, there was another biochemist called Daniel Koshland, and he said that actually these enzymes, they are not so rigid, because when you think about a lock and a key, it's a very rigid molecule, right? A lock, there's no flexibility with the lock. And so Koshland said enzymes or these proteins are not really so rigid, right? We have to think about them being flexible. And today, of course, we know that if you have a sigma bond, right, if you think about amino acids that make up protein, they have lots of different conformations, because depending on the bond angles and rotation and other side groups, they can behave in different conformations. And so Koshland said that, well, these enzymes are flexible, and so rather than just a substrate fitting into the lock and opening it, maybe the substrate binds to this protein, this enzyme, and it induces some conformational change, meaning it changes the shape of that protein, and only then the enzyme or the protein continues its activity. Right? So that was Daniel Koshland's model, and today we know that indeed is true. In fact, we can actually experimentally determine the rate of conformational change of a protein. Once the substrate binds, we can actually find the rate as how fast does it actually change its conformation. Right? We have techniques which we call rapid kinetic techniques or rapid quench techniques, where we can quench an enzyme in the matter of milliseconds. And that way we can actually see that conformational change. Keep in mind, if you think about the rate of the chemical step of these enzymes, it is very quick. We cannot actually even measure how fast those reactions are, right? It is over 500 to 1,000 per second is some of the rate. But a conformational change, if it's around 50 to 100 per second, we can actually measure it, because we have instruments like rapid quench or stop flow fluorescence where we can look at that. Anyway, so Koshland said this, this is how enzymes work. They have a substrate and they induce the conformational change. And so when we start thinking about that, Koshland's theory came about for about maybe 7 or 8 years. And then we also know there was another person that came about, was Jacques Monod. If you remember studying the structure of hemoglobin, again, those of you who are in the pharmacy program, you know that hemoglobin, right, has different conformational states. They have the so-called tense state, the T state, and they have the R state, the relaxed state. And as oxygen binds, the state changes from tense to relaxed. And so Monod said that, well, it is not just a substrate binding to an active site like Fischer said, like the lock and key. Koshland said substrate induces the conformational change. Monod said you might have these other molecules, he called them allosteric molecules, that they could bind at a site different from the active site and induce that conformational change to allow the protein to basically function. And we see that in a lot of the multimeric subunit proteins, like hemoglobin is a prime example. And so the idea was that, okay, if this is the way that these proteins work, where they have the substrate, right, it binds to the protein or the enzyme and causes the activity, what if we have a protein that is having a different behavior that we don't want to happen? So can we make some molecule that resembles the substrate, right, or resembles that allosteric type of molecule that Monod basically postulated, where we can prevent either the conformational change or the key from opening the lock or inducing the relaxed state from the tense state, right? So that was the thinking that we had till about 1960s. That was, Monod there, 1960 over here, right? And so we started thinking about making substrate analogs. So we know that the enzyme is binding the substrate, like the ligand. So what if we make something that looks like the substrate, but it is not the substrate? So it will bind, and it traps the enzyme in that particular shape or conformation, where now no longer can the enzyme process its natural substrate, right? Substrate analog, anti-metabolite, very classical way of drug design. If you think of most of the anti-cancer drugs that came about in the 1960s, right? Methotrexate, one example, right? Anyone remembers what methotrexate inhibits? What enzyme? Dihydrofolate reductase for making, goes on to make thymidine, right? If you think about the nucleotide agents, I can talk about, for example, aracetin, ribinocytosine, which is again used for anti-cancer. We can come back and think about AZT, looking for anti-AIDS. Keep in mind, AZT was a drug that was actually made in the 1960s against leukemia. Okay, AZT was developed in 1967 to treat leukemia, but was found to be too toxic, and so it never went into clinical trials. It was only after AIDS came about in the 1980s that they went back and tested AZT with the HIV retro the RT, reverse transcriptase, where they found it had little bit higher activity against the human DNA polymerase, and AZT came out to be a drug for AIDS. But again, based on this anti-metabolite, which means something that looks like the natural metabolite, but it is not the natural metabolite. So that is what we saw in the 1960s, the anti-metabolite theory. Then, of course, those of you who are in medicinal chemistry will remember Hansch's QSAR, quantitative structure activity relationship, where they started making a series of compounds based on either the molecular refraction or the electronic effects, or some type of let's say property that the molecule have. And if you make a series, you could put an algorithm and see which was the most active agent. So that was Corbin Hansch's design, where we call 1970s QSAR modeling rational drug design. So that came about, and then of course we got a little bit more sophisticated because computers started coming out, and so we could start thinking of making these molecular libraries, high throughput screening. In silico, now we can do in silico measurement, where we can just put a molecule and predict, okay, what is the metabolism, what is the pharmacokinetics, right? And we're using that type of database to design our molecules. So that is where we've been for the last, I would say, almost 20, 30 years. And what I want to talk a little bit later, as we will come to, is the system of PROTACs. That is the proteolyzing targeting chimeras. Because this is a completely new paradigm of thinking about enzyme inhibition and drug development. Before, we were always thinking about how can we inhibit the protein, right? This is a aberrant protein. It is doing something that we don't want, whether it is maybe for antibiotic development. If you think about penicillin, right? Basically, the peptidoglycan, it prevents peptidoglycan synthesis. So it prevents the bacterial peptidoglycans from being made. But this is that rather than inhibiting the protein, how about we just degrade the protein? Basically, get rid of it and use the natural cellular system that degrades protein. So that is what a PROTAC is, okay? Proteolyzing, targeting chimera. So if we can target the protein of interest that we don't want, right, rather than inhibiting it, can we destroy it? So it is not even in the cell. And if it's not in the cell, then it cannot do that aberrant property that we don't like. Okay, so that is, we come to that. But again, like I said, what I want to do is talk a little bit more about the history, and then I'll come to the products. Okay. I just wanted to review some general concepts on enzyme chemistry again, because we're talking mainly about drug inhibition and drug development. Keep in mind, if you have an enzyme and a substrate, right, it binds. So you can see on binding, it comes to a little lower energy. But in order for that substrate to basically convert it into product, it goes through a high energy state, which is called the transition state, right? And what enzymes can do, it can reduce the height of that transition state, meaning it lowers the energy barrier. And the only reason we get the increase in the energy level as the molecule is going from substrate to product is because bonds are breaking, and when you break bonds, basically charges are being developed on either side, right? You have a covalent bond. If that bond is breaking, then you have delta positive, delta negative. Anytime you increase the charge, the energy is going to go up because now it is no longer stabilized. And so, what enzymes can do? They stabilize those charges that are being formed as the product is being made, and they lower that transition state, and so the reaction can go faster. So basically, enzymes just act as catalysts. They lower the activation energy. So I just want you to keep that in mind, because as we talk about some of the enzyme inhibitors that have been developed, and then we get to the PROTAC, it is all about, okay, how do we try and interfere in this overall reaction? E plus S gives you the binding E dot S, right? Then you get the activated state, and then you get the product which is bound to the enzyme, and finally product is basically dissociating of the enzyme. And if you think about it as a kineticist, one should be able to measure each of these rate constants, E plus S to ES, ES to ES star, right, because that's a reaction, ES star to EP, and E to dissociated product. If we truly had the instrumentation, each of these kinetics rates should be able to be measured. But of course, we know that ES to EP is way too fast, right? That is taking place anywhere, estimates are from 1,000 a second to 3,000 a second. There is no instrumentation we have today that can measure a rate that is 1,000 a second. Have you ever thought about rate constants, first order rate constants, right? If you think of the T half, right, of a rate, the T half for a first order rate constant, and I'm trying to take you back to some of your kinetics, is 0.693 upon the K, which is the rate, right, of the rate constant. So if a reaction is 1,000 per second, think about the T half. 0.693 divided by 1,000 seconds. There is no instrument you can measure it in such a short period of time, right? So it is almost impossible to measure the actual chemical rate constant of an enzyme. The only thing we can do is estimate it. And what people have done is that, let's say if you had a phosphorus bond in there, like C phosphorus, you can change the phosphate to a sulfur, slow it down. And that way you can estimate based on the size of the sulfur versus the phosphorus, you can make some predictions. Otherwise, physically, we cannot really measure. But we can measure dissociation, right? We can measure this with the on rate and the off rate we can measure. And like I said, we can measure the conformation. The ES to ES star, we can measure that because that is within the time period of being able to measure. So this is how we look at an enzyme reaction and how we can inhibit it. And so for the past 100 years or so, we've been interfering with this way of making drugs. How do we prevent this enzyme to make that product? If we put S, which is an inhibitor, I, then it will be E plus I to basically stop the reaction from taking place. I'm not going to go through this. This is what we talked about, Fisher's lock and key. Okay. Then this is, you can see that's the substrate, fits into the lock, right? So that's the key, lock, nice rigid structure, and the product. Koshland, you have again the substrate, fits into the enzyme, but now you can see the shape from a rectangular, it has become oval. That is the conformational change because we said the protein was flexible. So it binds the enzyme and changes its conformation. Right? So that is Koshland's model, and here again the product. And then this is monos where you have these inhibitors that are these allosteric sites, different to where the substrate binds. You can see S up there and then A for allosteric, and that influences basically. And so today we know we have so-called competitive inhibitors, right, which are molecules that resemble the substrate, the anti-metabolites, like I said, the first generation anti-cancer agents, right? They are like enzyme binding to substrate, competitive. They bind to the enzyme and they dissociate off the enzyme, right? Depending on how tight that binding is. If it binds very tightly, then the enzyme gets stuck. But ultimately, it will dissociate, right? Then you have the non-competitive inhibitors, which is more like an allosteric. Binds to a site other than the substrate site, but still prevents the enzyme from basically working. And then, of course, we have the irreversible inhibitors, right? We have the suicide inhibitors, and I'll come to that as well. And then we have the transition state inhibitors, which presently are probably one of the most active type of drugs, the transition state inhibitors. But we'll go through each of them. So you can see competitive, enzyme substrate complex, and then catalyzing into product, right? If you have an inhibitor that resembles the substrate, like your anti-metabolite, enzyme inhibitor, no product, right? But keep in mind, inhibitor can dissociate from the bound state, which means if you have more substrate, then the substrate can bind and give you product, right? And so basically when you think about competitive inhibition, the tenet is that it is always binary binding, right? Only two things can bind. Either the enzyme binds with the substrate or the enzyme binds with the inhibitor. But substrate can always overcome the inhibition. And so what happens in resistance? When you think about drug resistance with a competitive inhibitor, basically the cell just makes more substrate. And whenever you have inhibitor that dissociates, if substrate is in more, right, just by population, substrate will now bind to the enzyme and you will get the product. And that is what resistance is. If you think about vancomycin resistance, have you ever heard of vancomycin resistance? One of the ways the bacteria overcome vancomycin is that they just make a much thicker cell wall, peptidoglycan, right? So now, and you can only give so much of vancomycin to the patient, otherwise you're going to cause a kidney problem. And so what the bacteria do, they make a very thick peptidoglycan which oversaturates any of the vancomycin, but can still make the cell wall, and you've got vancomycin. So that is making more substrate. The bacteria is making a lot more peptidoglycan, the substrate, and so it overcomes the resistance, right? So that's what we mean by competitive inhibition. Non-competitive, keep in mind, you can have a binding site for the substrate, yes, or you can have an allosteric site for the inhibitor, and so non-competitive is what we call ternary binding, right? Ternary, because all three can be bound together, enzyme, substrate, and inhibitor. But keep in mind, because the inhibitor is bound, the amount of product that's formed